Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about works of Seiichi Shirai, who I'm sure most of you haven't heard of his work probably. So I thought when Tony, I understand that this series about choosing each unit tutor choosing a practitioner that we like or we're inspired by. I thought very hard. It's quite a difficult thing to think about. And Shirai Seiichi was somebody my grandfather actually was an architect, really loved the work of. And also we came across his work quite intensely when we were doing a project at the Barbican about 3 years ago. And I just thought that as I was very inspired by David's talk a few weeks ago when he talked about his own work and inspirations, I thought I would do something similar. So this is a very personal choice, and as I said, I don't think he's that well known outside of Japan. But I think, as well as talking about an individual architect, I would like to really the conversations about translations and reframing in what we do. So I hope you find it interesting too. I think Shirai's work is very complicated and very strange at times. Find it very unique because of his upbringing as well, his education as well, which I'll cover. I'll talk about this a bit later. This is one of the prehistoric sites next to a museum that he's built a gallery, which is one of the projects that I'll talk about. This is him. I think his work often gives me hope or courage because of his strangeness and his uniqueness and his kind of personal pursuit for elegance. And I think, he's someone that I really kind of I learned a lot about this notion of translations, reframing of language and form in architecture, as well as obviously many other architects that have inspired me. He is someone during the peak of international modernism in Japan, kind of opposed this idea of going along with this, internationalism and looked to more of a continuity, history, the archaic, the primitive, and the classical, and not just in a way of a stylistic approach, but genuine interest in all of those things. And this, his work is pre-postmodern, so you could kind of imagine how strange all of that was. And I think today I want to talk as an architect, designer, rather than it becoming a academic or research. So I don't have a huge academic knowledge of his work or his writing. I also, want to say that this is not just about the Japanese context. This is one of the projects that I'll talk about, a Shimwa bank building. So as you know, I find the translation of language in architecture interesting, and the unit 8, we discuss this a lot. We always do precedent studies, and we then discuss those things with the work of our students and the critics. But of course, when we're discussing about an individual architect's work or a project like this, it's very difficult to talk outside of context or any other thread at the time. So I'll talk about other architects that were inspired by Shirai or other things that were happening at the time alongside. And also, of course, all of this work is beyond just singular culture. And when you see a photograph like this, you probably couldn't, like at first, when I first saw this photo, I thought, what a strange thing. You got a bit of a Greek column, a bit of a sort of terrazzo floor that's marking a line, and all of these kind of arches. And then there's this sort of almost Japanese traditional ceiling structure exposed. So all of these things were kind of collaged into his work, I think. So I would talk about his work first of all, and then I would move on to one project that we were inspired, I think, when we were looking at Shirai's work. He studied, all of this strangeness, I suppose, comes from the fact that he studied philosophy and history in Kyoto around 1920s. And in 1928, he traveled to Germany to study philosophy further. And he didn't study architecture at the time. He got very interested in Gothic architecture, and he started to attending history and art lectures, and then moved to a university in Berlin. 1933, he returned to Japan, and 2 years later, he was helping a friend or a relative build a house, and he found that he got very, very involved with the design and instructing, contractors on site. And so there he began his profession, really. Amongst his other works are NOA building, Shoto Museum, etc. But I'll pick up two projects this evening. He didn't really write very much about his work. These are books that, the one on the left is a series of essays. I think one of only essay collection of his. One on the right is, so there were all these books about people analyzing his work, because he didn't really leave very much explanation about his work. It's actually, I was even reading about this account by Arata Isozaki on Shirai's work, but I think even he's finding it very difficult to kind of understand what it's really all about. One thing I wanted to mention in the context of all of this is that he was very inspired by this figure called Bruno Taut. I don't know if you know his work, a German architect who lived in Japan. He's supposedly known as someone who rediscovered Japanese architecture through writing about Katsura Villa. And I think Shirai saw a lot of similarities in that they both lived in cultures that were not not their birthplace. And Shirai talks about in one essay, it's sort of 3-page long, not very long, about Bruno Taut and how he kept on missing Taut. So when he was in Germany, Taut lived in Japan, and when Taut escaped Japan, or left Japan, Shirai returned, and so on. And I think this kind of notion of, and Shirai throughout his career was almost like this kind of misfit in the Japanese modernist movement, but well respected, I guess. And I think I find that quite interesting, this notion that you could be off the mainstream of architectural conversation, but has some sort of a impact as well. And that's the sort of thing I wanted to talk about in terms of practitioners I find interesting. So the first project is a Seisuikan in Shizuoka, which was finished in 1981. It was for an artist, Keisuke Serizawa. He's a textile designer artist in the kind of the mold of the Japanese arts and craft movement called Mingei movement. You may know of Yanagi. He did all these butterfly chairs, and so Serizawa was one of the group of artists working together. And this museum is for Serizawa's work. Shizuoka is about an hour's kind of bullet train journey from Tokyo. These are the sort of works that Serizawa was doing. Kimono textiles and things like that. And the museum is actually located next to a really important archaeological site of prehistoric Japanese inhabitation. And this one is actually called Yayoi culture, which is a sort of the farming culture. But this is interesting because Shirai has written a essay called The Jomon Style. The Jomon Style is a period before Yayoi period, where the time of hunter-gatherer age. And what Shirai found really interesting was this kind of more architectural, language that's embedded on the ground, the earth, the sort of chunky sort of structures, heavy roof, as opposed to, say, this more sophisticated, lifted off the ground, Yayoi period examples where people like Taut and Tange argued that a lot of Japanese sophisticated architecture, like Katsura Villa, which I'll talk about later, came from this more of this kind of agricultural, farming-based culture. But I think Shirai, with the book, The Jomon Style, made a really, really big impact at the time of that modernist era in Japan. And this kind of structure where it's completely just sort of off the ground, and the floor is actually lower than the ground level. So, if you're not familiar, this is Katsura Villa, which Taut had written a lot about, and people like Kenzo Tange, who was the leading figure at the time in Japan, praised this architecture, and all of that. Japanese modernism is really always about this dialogue with this culture, and you can see internally these kind of planar language has maybe something common with Nate's lecture a few weeks ago as well. But Shirai actually preferred something else, which is this old Nirayama residence, which he apparently visited very regularly. And it's this house with this enormous roof, and kind of reminiscent of those Jomon style huts, primitive huts. And he talks about this a lot in his essays, about this kind of notion of prehistory, element of wetness of the rice fields, the chunkiness of the structures. And I think in that essay book, which is actually called Muso, as in no windows, that's the title of the essay book. And I think he's really interested in this idea of, introverted structures. And then these are the sort of internal structures. You can see the kind of the reference to the primitive, earthy, large roof, heavy kind of structural expressions. And I think when Shirai was talking about this, I don't think she was necessarily discussing about what it means to do a Japanese modern building. I think he was talking about this kind of reference to the prehistoric in a more universal sense. And he's someone that traveled a lot and lived in Europe. And of course, he knew all about the development of modernism at the time. And I think he was trying to look for something beyond that kind of sophisticated elegance of simplicity, which I really enjoy. And I think you can read in a lot of the essays his reference to something wider than just this kind of Japanese culture. So this is and he talks about the smell of these spaces as well, like how important the smell of these spaces are to him. So the building itself, you kind of go through these kind of load-bearing stone walls, and these kind of very exaggerated steps, and then you go through some of these series of arches and floor sort of threshold separated by these kind of polished stone floors. I mean, I have to say that it took me a very long time to start to even understand what he was doing, and to this day I'm not sure if I fully understand it. It's just more of the, I suppose, the feeling of what I get from these images. And when we were discussing this project internally in the office and trying to think of translating this in a project, it wasn't necessarily to do with literal translation, but it's just about the spirit of it. You'll see later when I show you our project, I can't claim that we have this kind of quality of, but you can see that these arches are like really unconventional. They're sometimes wider, sometimes flatter, sometimes, they're not, I would say, a Palladian, kind of beautiful geometry either. It's something really strange about each of these spaces, and I'll talk about this later, about Shirai's amateurism, which Fujimori talks about. And then you see like these kind of detailing where you have this very slim frame holding up this glazing inside this kind of cave-like stone external wall. And you encounter this, you can't quite tell whether that is really kind of working or not. And I found that really interesting and challenging. And also very, something quite appealing, this slight strangeness of like this frame standing in the middle of glazing, and then you got this other arch, and then another arch. And then you can see his trademark of always designing the ceiling in a really specific way. So each space would have its own ceiling design. There is this connection to the almost like cave-like space outside. And then these really specifically located thresholds of reflective stone detailing is very interesting, sometimes reflecting light and creating that literally a threshold, just without a material threshold. And this other striking thing is his introduction of verticality in spaces that you don't kind of expect. And as I said, the ceiling is always expressed in some way. And then these arches, he meant them to open up. These were part of the publication for a book dedicated to the project, but I'll show you some of my photos later when Serizawa's work has inhabited this space, and you see the difference. But Shirai intended that these are open windows, and the light is coming through, pretty much in a sense of like a traditional Japanese deep plan spaces. And then you get these kind of very strange situations of like, a fireplace or a sort of a European, referenced detailing, working together with this meshed kind of quite Japanese ceiling design. And then you've got like this stone, kind of pad stone or kind of support structure, and then the timber joists, etc. And that's the plan of this museum. And it's essentially a series of connected spaces of different degrees of light and size. And then there are all these strange, no, I keep using the word strange, I'm sorry, but there's all these twisted geometry, within the roof that refers to the plan. But if you look at the plan, it's so sort of actually rigid. And then within the spaces, you have these unexpected events in the roof and the heights and etc. I guess, and we return to this image a lot. The project that I'm going to talk about later, we had a project architect who is Japanese, and the reason why we were looking at these carefully was because the clients lived in Japan for 20 odd years, and they knew practically more about Japanese culture and architecture than us. And it was a kind of a big challenge for us to really kind of learn about this tradition of architecture. But again, this kind of collage of elements we found really, really inspiring and freeing, actually, for us. Yeah, sort of. This is the sort of way down to that corner, circular space. And you can see that in places that there is always this reference to those kind of primitive huts and the Jomon kind of spaces. But also equally, you could say that maybe these are something that he saw when traveling around Europe. And then the whole building is actually almost like surrounded by this like moat-like stone structure. So you don't really see very much from outside of the building. So you kind of, sorry, this is the start of my images, but you go through these series of walls really to get access, and you're sort of going through the layers of these kind of maze spaces. And you don't really know, where you're heading. Actually, it's almost literally like a series of cave spaces and primitive spaces, and then you suddenly come across these kind of very celebrated water features and tree planted symmetrically, and all of these. I mean, his detailing might be unconventional, but the craftsmanship and the level of attention of working with each craftsman that were involved with the project was, I hear, it was exemplary. And all of the stonework came from Korea, and he used to fly to Korea to check all these production and choice of materials. But I just think through my images, which are not obviously as beautiful as those published in the books, but what I wanted to talk about is how different it is from those photographs in a way. And I understand that Serizawa and Shirai actually fell out towards the end of the construction because of all of these different preferences over lighting conditions and the characters of the spaces that Shirai wanted and Serizawa wanted. I mean, they're both very strong figures, and Serizawa is obviously much more preoccupied with how to show his artifacts and his work, and Shirai is concerned with the theatricality of the spaces. And again, okay, that's not a very nice story, but I found it very kind of interesting that there are two artists really kind of not compromising. And I think there's something nice about that too. So this is what it's like at the moment as a museum, which is very different to the theatricality of the photographs. But nevertheless, you do get these kind of interesting juxtaposition of scales and openings, but all the time you feel like you're in this kind of cocooned primitive space, really. And then these kind of very strange things happen where like the glazing butts against the end and very slim frame, but then you have completely different materials inside and outside, and I think it's fascinating. And then outside, rather than those kind of elegant the column-based details like a Katsura Villa, I think Shirai's one is much more kind of rough and heavy and pronounced. And this is sort of looking back at the entrance, back onto the park of the Toro Iseki archaeology site. And the water features. And these are interesting, the sections are quite interesting, and how the building's situated within this wall. So it's all kind of quite an interior world. This is the sketch, watercolor sketch of the plan. So the next building, I've not visited, but I thought this is interesting. While I was preparing the lecture, I thought rather than just talk about one project, maybe I can speak about this second project as well. And this is called Shimwa Bank Building, otherwise known as Kaishokan, finished in 1974. It's in Nagasaki, 1975, in Nagasaki, which is south of Japan. These are all the books, images from a really incredible book that my grandfather left for me, and it has a text by Arata Isozaki, who, if you don't know, he's another Japanese architect that worked for Kenzo Tange and later became a very strong postmodernist and recently received his Pritzker Prize. But anyway, my interest is what Isozaki wrote about this project, and he talks about Isozaki talks about so Shirai was practicing Chinese calligraphy every day, and it was something he did, daily, and my grandfather used to do the same. Where I always wondered what it was all about. I still don't know, but it's literally copying a old ancient Chinese text with brush and ink, and you just sit there all day and just sort of literally do these kind of brushing strokes. I used to go to my grandfather's study, and there's like piles of paper with the same, what looked like same text every day. Anyhow, apparently Shirai, I discovered later that Shirai was also doing that, and Isozaki writes in the book that you cannot discuss Shirai's work without discussing or understanding his interest in calligraphy. I read on, but I'm sorry to say that I can't give you much more insight into that. But there's just the fact that there's this kind of, I suppose, relationship between the brush and your stroke, the regular activity, and the architectural practice, which I think is an interesting topic. And I suppose, Isozaki goes on to talk about that and the relationship with context, but it was sort of beyond my head. But this another interesting thing that Isozaki suspects is that while Shirai was designing this building, or just before, Shirai was staying near Lake Como in Italy, and there is a Romanesque church there, which I don't have a photograph of, but Isozaki suspects that there's a sort of a lot that he learned from that. And Nagasaki, I don't know if you know, is a port city, and there's sort of these kind of hills and mountains, and then this new bank building connected to the other wing was built here. And so, there may be some references to Romanesque church, but there's also this sort of sense that it's, again, very primitive, very earthy, very all of this stone wall was sort of handmade and hand-built. And it's strange because this building was for a bank's computer center. And Isozaki suspects that, again, Shirai is actually being this kind of difficult character opposing, Isozaki is saying, well, it's strange because if it's a bank center, modernism is perfect. But then you see through the pictures, it just looks nothing like a computer center. And I think the point, again, I want to make, which, we speak about in the unit 2, is this idea of, does form really have to follow function? Do we have to really design for one programmatic use? It's this ambiguity of following program is a really interesting topic. Yeah. And I think Isozaki even goes further to say that Shirai was rejecting at the time the reality and the speed of Japan's economic growth. This is middle of 1970s. And trying to express through his architecture this different, different, I suppose, approach. I don't believe that it was nostalgic or looking back or things like that. I think Shirai was sort of always searching for something like this since the days of looking at the primitive huts. I won't really explain because I can't, but I think the photographs from this book are absolutely amazing, and you could see the textural differences, the detailing, and some of these very evocative tactile characters, and these very interesting referencing and almost sort of betrayal of these kind of referencing as well at the same time. So the translations don't come so naturally, but he almost embraces these collisions of culture. And yeah, I don't know if the colors are quite right there, but and then to kind of add this kind of facade entrance onto this stone body is also very strange and interesting. And then there's a sort of traditional roof on the top. This is it from a bit further out, and you can see these openings, little openings, and then the two wings on the sides are clad in this kind of metal detail. And you can see that, I mean, there are windows, but it's pretty much an introverted building. And I think that's one of the things that he embraced, that because it's a computer center, you could just be quite introverted, I suppose. And then this very, I don't know if it's on my screen, it's this very bright, almost, lipstick red, like really strong red entrance porch. And then these kind of strange things happening on the side with castle-like, kind of almost this kind of protected interior. Yeah. And then this, I really particularly enjoy these kind of very kind of fat side elevations with almost, the roof might as well be a thatched roof, or and then these very, very interesting window details that sometimes don't align just by a stone. It's the sort of thing that I used to get told off in architecture school. And then these kind of junction of the two, which again is particularly interesting. And so on. I think inside, Isozaki talks about this building, and he says that there are lots of metaphors in this building and lots of references, which is true. But one of the things that he talks about is that maybe one of the strongest metaphor for Isozaki is this idea of darkness, which refers to perhaps the Jomon style primitive huts. But I think there's more about that darkness that I enjoy, which is maybe referencing something of European medieval architecture. Maybe it's to do with the deep plan Japanese tea houses. This celebration of darkness, as you may know, was also a topic of In Praise of Shadows, which is a very well-known essay by a writer, Junichiro Tanizaki, talking about the depth of Japanese architecture, and then as you get through these layers of spaces, you just about figure out that I mentioned lipstick, but the geisha, or doesn't need to be geisha actually, but this kind of bright red lipstick is the only thing you see in this darkness. And I think there's definitely those kind of referencing. At the time, I read that people like Tanizaki wrote that essay because they were so afraid of this international modernism arriving in Japan and wiping essentially the entire traditional culture. Tanizaki talks about stainless steel and white tiles as the kind of the main downfall of Japanese architecture. So these are sort of maybe it's similar time. So I think maybe it was on Shirai's minds as well. But what's different with Shirai, I think, is this kind of complete love for this European, medieval, Gothic, Baroque, and playing of compositions and arrangements. So it's not just about these kind of dark atmosphere, which we really enjoy, but I think there's a sort of really, really kind of rich detailing in his work. And it's interesting, there's another quite well-known essay by Alison and Peter Smithson about, I think it's called A Silent Architect or Silent Architects, mentions about Leverance, which was last week's subject, or Eames, I can't quite imagine Eames being silent, but Leverance or Melnikov or those kind of architects. And I think Shirai belongs in that category where he left virtually no writing of his own work, and the work kind of speaks for what he wanted to say, I guess. Which is another point that Isozaki makes about his work, saying that this building really does prove that architecture. He goes on to say that architecture actually exists to speak about something, not necessarily just to respond to a program, which I thought it was very strong. So I just quickly finished these. I mean, these are some of the, I suspect, like members' rooms, or where they take, the bank takes the clients up to discuss, I don't know, financial agreements or something. I don't know. There's sort of very extravagant spaces in some of the rooms. I don't see any computer in there. And then these views out to the port, Nagasaki port. Sasebo port, actually, sorry, to be precise. These are the drawings, which are equally fascinating. It's almost kind of quite bodily as well. Very, and these are the details. I suspect it's a concrete structure with stone cladding, and this metal cladding, and really quite interesting, like the entrance geometry and plan, arches happening both on the section and on the plan. Just quickly, before finishing with just a quick photo of our work, I just want to put this all in context. As I mentioned Kenzo Tange, I think those of you who might not know his work, he did these kind of projects, equally stunning and beautiful. This is a Tokyo Cathedral, which is one of my favorite buildings of Tange's. He worked for Maekawa Kunio, who worked for Le Corbusier. Corbusier had, many assistants all over the world, I suspect, and Maekawa worked in Paris and also later worked back in Japan and realized some of the projects with Korb, I think. And Tange very much is that next generation, really kind of trying to push Japan from a country of followers to, this is not my words, followers to, one of the leaders of architectural scene. This is a project that interests me from the point of view that when talking about Shirai, I think this is quite interesting. This is Kenzo Tange's own house, and you can see that there's sort of columns sort of being interrupted by the balcony and the horizontal line. And this is something I find really interesting because, you know, the more I work, the more I think the essence of architecture, to me at least, is about this sort of vertical line, horizontal line. It's quite simple, and how do you really work with those two things? And I understand that there's a sort of very different approach reading in Shirai's essays to Tange, where because Tange was very much a learner of Corbusier and Pilotti's, the vertical line is usually quite easily cut by a horizontal line, and it's not continuous. I mean, you might argue it is continuous, but it's actually cut by quite a strong recess. Whereas here, Shirai's another project, you know, the vertical purity is always somehow retained, even though there's a sort of a surface in front of it. And then in Shirai's case, you know, like the tatami mat is used on the ceiling, which is kind of unheard of and very kind of strange thing to do, applying this texture on the ceiling. This is an image that I found of Shirai later on, actually, after we finished the Barbican project, and we were quite surprised how faithful we were to the master. But this kind of relationship is very interesting, and this kind of octagonal. This is Kenzo Tange's submission, realization of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial building. You can see that the columns are very much Pilotti's. This is Shirai's competition entry, where the column starts to act this kind of like symbolic vertical presence. And this is something that he talks about quite a lot. Well, not quite a lot, sorry, I take that back. A little bit in his essay, in not many words. It's actually written a lot in the other analytical book, where there's a sort of whole discussion and discourse about Shirai's columns. And I found this conversation very, very interesting. And then, cut long story short, I'm just trying to say that there are others who are really inspired by Shirai, including, you may know this architect Terunobu Fujimori, who collaborates recently with Takeshi Hayatsu of Hayatsu Architects and Kingston University. But this is a project that Fujimori did at the Barbican Center. They literally built this tea house inside the Barbican Center exhibition. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about is how Fujimori talks about Shirai as an amateur architect. And again, that's another kind of an interesting thing I wanted to share, that, you know, architects being inspired by someone who they think were quite amateurish. I think, you know, that's a kind of strange thing, but it's interesting. I think Fujimori is deeply respectful in that when he says that. It's about freedom. It's about, you know, not belonging to some sort of a language that you are sort of brought up. Fujimori compares to, for example, Tange, who, you know, is very much the Le Corbusier line of education. Fujimori as well is an architecture historian and a critic. Only became an architect at a very, very late age. So he does things like this. And I think apparently really Shirai's work is one of the works that really inspired Fujimori. And I suspect that this is maybe someone you might know more, Kazuo Shinohara, another iconic Japanese architect who was the teacher of people like Toyo Ito, etc. I think there is a deep connection between Shinohara and Shirai's work. Perhaps not, I don't know, I'm suspecting. This is one of really kind of interesting projects by Shinohara, where the whole floor is earth, and these kind of tree-like columns inside holding up this kind of very white void space. This is another of Shinohara's projects. with this kind of very heavy concrete inside a minimal space. So after all that, I feel a little bit overwhelmed by the precedents, and this must be how all of you might be feeling in our unit when we study our precedents and then move on to the design. But anyway, I just wanted to, I suppose, just show you this project and explain some of the inspirations that we were having. As you know, it's an apartment and it's an interior project, but we were very much interested to create how can we create architecture inside a small space. And as I said, the clients were introduced to us through a architectural professor in America, a mutual friend, and he's American, she's English, and they both lived in Japan longer than me, actually. And they've traveled every prefecture in Japan. They're really crazy architectural and arts followers. So the pressure was on, and we've never really designed a traditional Japanese space before, and let alone detailing traditional Japanese elements like that. But they brought their own tatami mats that they got handmade in Tokyo, and their brief to us was we would really like to push as far as possible the notion of traditional language in a contemporary space. So obviously the apartment is it's situated in a fantastic precedent in itself, and we were deeply mindful of respecting what's there. So this is taking off what was there before. Inspired by the original building, of course. And this was the floor plan that we inherited. We began with a column. Of course, we don't need a column, but we wanted to have a column. So we started with a column and started to sort of think how could this space emerge out of a new column. And I promised my unit today that I would try and make this relevant to what they're looking at, but it's sort of similar to what we saw last week at Pitsanga Manor when Sohn, made a Roman ruin in his garden when there wasn't a ruin there. In a way, this column is not structural; it's a symbolic gesture, rather like Shirai. And so we kind of plotted this column and then started to think, okay, there's an open plan. Could an open plan be divided into different activities that our client wanted to use the spaces for? Because we took a bedroom away, we were now ending up with a very large floor plate. And we thought that there should be some form of dividing this space. And then we were doing drawings like this where we thought about a column, the tatami mat they brought there from Japan. How do we actually introduce these kind of sliding screens that work with that? And then obviously there's the concrete structure of the barbican that existed. This was the sort of the sketches of the screens that we were thinking to develop. And then to see, so this is the Japanese room in here, where we could actually lay down the tatami mats, which, by the way, is a human size. Each tatami mat is a module that created most of Japanese architectural proportions. And a kitchen space and just an open living space, and what we call a genkan space in Japan. Your entry point is really important, so we wanted to create its own architectural gesture there. So it's really also about how to create a space that's larger than it actually is, and that's something also that we learned a lot from Shirai, but many other Japanese tradition like tea houses. And I don't know if we were that aware at the time, but we were really we thought that designing the ceiling was very much important part of this project, and that ceiling could actually have a lot of weight. These are some of the sections, and you could see these kind of interesting sections of the existing, into which we embedded a stereo system, and this is a existing fire escape door. We didn't put the arch there; it was there already, but really quite welcome. This is a sort of a card model of that kitchen box, I suppose, the kitchen volume. And this was us testing how would a terrazzo column would work with holding up the screen, light, very, very light timber screen, and how the bottom of the terrazzo could actually work as a space divider, a space threshold. So I suppose, rather like the Sekisuikan, we have this terrazzo, reflective terrazzo running on the perimeter of the space, and each time a different space sort of happens, we would have this threshold. Slightly kind of opposite way of a modernist spirit of open floor plan. And then this column is bang in the middle of the whole building, whole space, acting as this kind of a symbolic thing. In Japan, there's this sort of talk of daikokubashira, which means that a house always has a main column in the middle of the house that's holding up the entire house. And then these timber screens. These are the stereo units that the owner had, which we sort of fit into the curved concrete upstand. And then looking back at the Japanese room with a screen, so this became like the study. It's about 100 mil up from the carpeted area. This is an existing wall, which we've plastered over. And then the tatami mat module was actually really difficult because the climate in Japan and climate here are different, and these tatami mats were changing, expanding and contracting right up until we fitted them in. And because we designed a very unforgiving architecture with these terrazzo screen base, we had to really figure out ways of actually fitting these tatami into the void. I also really kind of enjoy this, existing outside balcony concrete slabs and how this worked on the edge. Completely kind of not expecting until we really started to see it come together on site. And I suppose this is what I mean, where, trying to create distance where there isn't one, creating perspective where there isn't one, really. Very tight space, but these kind of rhythms and the rhythm of the ceiling pieces create this kind of rather exaggerated sense, which is sort of also the feeling I got, looking at those pictures of Shirai's work and then visiting the museum. You realize how small it actually is in reality. And then this kind of, floor tiles were kind of this kind of glossy reflective tiles, almost kind of homage to that period of Japan, the Showa Taisho period, and then the soffit was exposed for as an original Barbican structure. And then you can see on the right here is what we call araidashi floor, where these kind of quite oversized pebbles are embedded into cement. Again, we couldn't find any builders that could do that, so we had to be quite patient on our knees and just show them how to do this as well, first few. And then the terrazzo column. And then this is it with the screen open. This is looking back at the entrance. So we clad the existing Barbican door with a timber door. And then the column in the corner of the tatami room, with it shut, sort of creates like this little cage inside the apartment. This is sort of, we decided that the bedroom wouldn't have anything too extravagant and left it very clean. Looking back at the living space, so the joinery in the bedroom, and then the archway onto the escape stair. This is the opening into the bedroom toilets, which I quite like this photograph. It's just sort of small opening, and bathrooms are all kind of fitted with these tiles imported from Japan, actually. And then I just thought I'll finish with some very quick tour of photos of my own after they've moved in, just to show how it's actually lived in. And actually this is me sort of trying to sit on the floor and take a photograph in that kind of Ozu film way. Do you know Ozu Yasujiro, the Japanese filmmaker that sort of always shot from this angle? I think he was very much a equivalent of Martin Scorsese in a way that never stopped his camera rolling and always shot the films from kind of this kind of angle. It's very interesting, cultural, again, this kind of cultural differences and contradictions. So the client after Japan lived in Scandinavia, hence all of these fittings that they had in their storage. So they all came out and started inhabiting this space. Sometimes they sit on the floor, sometimes they sit on these chairs. Looking back at the bedroom and the column. This is the junction that I was talking about that was really quite difficult to get right, with the 3 screens sliding, and then the tatami just fitting in, thank God. And then, you know, that photograph I showed you, that Shirai house that we discovered later, much later, had this kind of similar octagonal column and the threshold detail of the kitchen. It's really kind of like imagined universe that you create, really. It's a sort of a story making, as we saw with Sewn. It's really just sort of about, you know, making something where almost nothing really exists, and like that threshold didn't need to be there, but it's something we're sort of adding to. This is a view back from their dining table, kitchen. I like this image because it sort of really captures that sense of this strange Japanese joinery that we're putting into a brutalist building in London, seeing out onto the London skyline. I enjoyed this kind of discrepancy a lot. This is looking back. So we'd never really, you know, as I said, detailed anything like this or designed anything like this. It was a client request, and we were not sure at the beginning, but I think we were then up for the challenge, and we found a Japanese joiner based in Sussex that trained in Kyoto, English carpenter that trained in Kyoto, a traditional carpentry in Kyoto, and we worked with him all the way through, and it was a really fascinating experience and really enjoyable one to put a project like this together. Thank you.